Hey guys, this is a video about the kind of design process I go through when making new enemies for Epic Battle Fantasy V. And for those of you unfamiliar with the game, it's a sort of traditional JRPG, much like the old Final Fantasy games. So with that out of the way, let's start the video. So the first kind of major consideration I always keep in mind is that I try to tell the players quite a bit about an enemy just through its visual design. So for example, an enemy that bounces around quite a lot in its idle animation, you can probably assume it's going to have a high evade stat. And an enemy that, is in the air, if it's flying or hovering, you can probably assume it's immune to earth attacks. Or if it's red or black, you can probably assume it's a fire enemy. So these kind of cues and hints I kind of use to tell the player a bit about an enemy just right away without you even having to fight it or to scan it. You kind of can tell just by looking at it, hey, I can assume a few things about this enemy and I know how to attack it and what to watch out for. And I think this is very important because there's a lot of enemies in the game and I don't expect the player to memorize all of their stats. So it helps to have a rough idea that when you can figure out this kind of stuff just by looking at the enemy and not having to try to memorize every little detail about every enemy in the game. So that's the first major thing to remember. And the second one is each enemy that I make should try to add something new to the game, both kind of stylistically and visually, but also mechanically. So for example, I've already got 3 or 4 kind of beast animal type monsters. I've got mammoths, I've got bears, I've got dogs. And while they're all very different in size, they all kind of have a very similar body type. And there's only like so many different attacks that I can animate for them before they kind of start looking similar because they're all 4-legged animals. So I have to come up with different body types, different materials to make the foes out of. So for example, in the new game I'm making now, I've got enemies that kind of roll around on top of balls. I've got enemies that are floating haunted mirrors and stuff like that. So I'm trying to come up with new stuff that I haven't done before because this opens itself up to kind of very, very different attack animations, but also kind of different mechanical effects that you can have. Like, for example, the mirror enemy. A mirror reflects things, so right away you can think of some interesting things that this enemy can do that no other type of enemy could do just by looking at it and kind of seeing what it is. So that's something that I try to keep in mind. I try to go for different enemies, different body types, different materials to make them out of so that I can come up with different mechanics for all of them. And that takes me on to step number 3. So attack patterns. In previous games, the enemies were pretty dumb. They attacked at random if they were weak enemies without much consideration for anything. Stronger enemies, generally, their moveset changed as they got more hurt, so they kind of started using stronger attacks the more damage they took, but it was still usually pretty random. Even stronger enemies and bosses had sort of super powerful attacks that had cooldowns associated with them, so they didn't use them too often or just kind of randomly for no reason. I had to program in a bit more logic for those really strong attacks. But for the most part, enemies have been pretty dumb in previous games, and I think they are in most RPGs. That's not always a problem. This time I'm trying to do a bit more with that and give some enemy types kind of smarter AI. They're not going to be smart, so they're just going to be slightly smarter, yeah. They'll have kind of simple behaviors that are still quite dumb, but they're not random. So, for example, some enemies that kind of look smarter, some kind of humanoid type enemies like the ghosts, they will target specific players that are weak against different elements. And most enemies are too stupid to do this, but the kind of ones that appear to look like humans, you can look at them and think, hey, they're probably a bit smarter than your average beast. so they act like it too, and they'll target their spells accordingly. And similarly, beast enemies will now kind of attack whoever attacked them last, because that's the kind of behavior you would expect from a wild animal. So that opens up some new strategies. Like, it's still quite simple and quite predictable, but it means every new group of enemies you'll have to fight slightly differently. So for example, if you find a bunch of beasts, you can kind of hit them all with one player so that they're all drawn to attacking that one player, and then you can just buff his defense. So that's a sort of strategy you can use that you couldn't use if they didn't have this AI. So that's a kind of new feature that I'm trying to give to some enemies in this game that I haven't done before. And I'll try not to overdo it, because it is my first time trying to make something like this, and I don't want to mess it up too much. But I think it'll be fun. And if I communicate it well to the players what kind of behavior different enemies have, then I think it'll be a very fun mechanic to have. And the last thing I want to mention is enemy reskins. So a lot of people look at reskins of different enemy types and think, oh, that's really lazy. They just wanted to get more content out of a animation rig. And well, that's true, but it can also be used quite effectively. And for everyone that knows any game design, you'll know that when introducing new ideas, you kind of add them in incremental steps. You add like a simple problem, then the next time the player encounters it, it's a bit harder, and then a bit harder again. And I'm trying to do something similar with enemy reskins. My throat is really sore. So, in this case, the first time you encounter an enemy type, say for example a bear, it'll be like a normal brown bear. You know, it'll bite, it'll scratch, but it won't have any particularly interesting attacks. But then the next time you find a bear, it'll be a polar bear. And on top of the attacks you've already seen, it'll also have kind of ice attacks because it's a polar bear. And then later you'll find a panda bear that attacks with bamboo and stuff as well. So it kind of builds on top of the initial design, which with each new reskin that you encounter. And I think that's pretty good game design, because it means that the later monsters can be really complicated and really hard, but without being overwhelming, because the player's been eased into it. So that's the kind of points that I wanted to put into this video, and yeah, that's about it. That's all I wanted to say for now, so see you later.